Welcome to the Israel Illuminated channel. Today we will examine the sacrifices in the Bible. When we hear the word sacrifice today, most of us immediately feel tension. In modern culture, the idea of killing an animal as an act of worship sounds barbaric, something belonging to a distant world. And in a way, it can belong to a different world, even though today we might sacrifice a turkey for a Thanksgiving meal. But the Bible refuses to treat sacrifice as meaningless violence. Instead, it presents sacrifice as a God-designed system, precise, regulated, and deeply symbolic, meant to teach Israel and ultimately the nations what it means for sinful people to draw near to a holy God. The sacrifices were not for God, but for man. So, let's talk about it, plainly, carefully, and with open eyes. What were sacrifices in the Bible? What did they accomplish? And how should we understand them in light of the Messiah? Firstly, sacrifice was not chaos. It was covenant order. Scripture makes clear that Israel's sacrifices were not invented by human imagination. God commanded them, and He regulated them. There was a pattern. The animal had to be spotless without blemish and was slaughtered in a kosher way so that it received no pain. Not because God needed perfect meat, but because the offering symbolized wholeness, purity, and what was fitting to bring before a holy king. Secondly, the worshiper had to identify with the animal. This wasn't a detached ritual performed by professionals while the person watched from a distance. The person bringing the sacrifice was meant to understand that this involves me, or should have been me, and that an innocent animal died in my place. The offering stood in relation to the worshiper. Thirdly, in some cases, the worshiper participated in the act that brought the animal's life to an end. That moment taught something unforgettable. Approaching God is not casual, and sin is not a light matter. Life is sacred. Blood is serious. The altar was a teacher. And when these sacrifices were brought in faith, trusting God's instruction, God granted what the Torah calls atonement. But we need to be precise about what that means because the entire debate turns on this word. Next, we will unpack the Day of Atonement and forgiveness and removal pictured together. Leviticus 16, the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, brings the meaning of sacrifice into sharp focus. 2 goats were taken for the people corporately. 1 goat was sacrificed as a sin offering described in Leviticus 16:15. The other, the scapegoat, was sent away into the wilderness, shown in Leviticus 16:20-22. Together they dramatize 2 realities, cleansing and removal. Sin defiles and separates. God provides a way for impurity to be dealt with and carried away. This is not sentimental religion. This is God teaching Israel that sin creates real contamination and real distance, and that mercy is costly. Next, we will analyze the 5 offerings. Many people assume sacrifices were mainly about guilt, but the Torah gives multiple offerings because relationship with God involves multiple dimensions. There are 5 major offerings in the Torah: burnt offerings, grain offerings, peace offerings, sin offerings, and lastly the trespass and guilt offerings. All of these were described in the book of Leviticus chapters 2-7. Some offerings were voluntary, some mandatory, and most were divided into portions: God's portion, the priest's portion, and sometimes a portion eaten by the worshiper. That alone tells you something. Sacrifice wasn't just about punishment. It was also about communion, gratitude, devotion, and restored fellowship. First, the burnt offering expressed devotion. In it, the animal was wholly given, consumed on the altar. It communicated surrender and reverence. It also had atoning language attached to it shown in Leviticus 1:4, which already warns us not to limit atonement to one narrow category. Second, the grain offering offered the fruit of the field: fine flour, oil, salt, often with a drink offering poured out revealed in Numbers 15:4-5. This wasn't about moral failure, it was about thanksgiving and recognizing God as provider. Next, the peace offering was a fellowship offering followed by a shared meal. Portions went to the priests, portions were burned to God, and the rest was eaten by the worshiper and participants. It was thanksgiving and communion, God allowing his people to eat in his presence as a sign of peace. Next, the sin offering dealt with sin and defilement, restoring ritual fitness to approach God's sanctuary. The offering varied depending on the person's role and means: bulls, goats, birds, or even fine flour for the very poor. The blood was handled in prescribed ways because blood served a priestly function in relation to sacred space. Lastly, the trespass or guilt offering was always a ram. It often dealt with cases where restitution was required. The pattern is important. Sin doesn't only offend God, it can wrong people. So Torah worship was not an escape from responsibility. It included repentance, restitution, and sacrifice. It should be noted also that there technically were no sacrifices for intentional sins. Leviticus 4, 1-5:13 and Numbers 15, 22-31 says that when a man sins unintentionally, he should bring an offering to the Lord. It does not tell us what a man should do if he sins intentionally. Why? Because the Torah did not want to create the impression that a person could buy the freedom to intentionally commit a sin by having a sin offering ready. In other words, say that someone wanted to murder another person, then offer an intentional sin offering in order to make restitution back to God. The sacrifices were never designed to function like that, or to bribe God back into fellowship with him. Instead, if the person sins deliberately, that person must be cut off from the people of Israel as a punishment shown in Numbers 15:30. Next, we must address the big question: did Messiah replace the sacrificial system? Now we come to the issue that sparks debate. If the Messiah offered himself as the once-for-all sacrifice for sin, did that abolish the Levitical priesthood and the sacrificial laws? Many Christians assume yes. This assumption often comes packaged in what is sometimes called replacement theology. The belief that the church replaces Israel and the Torah, including sacrifices, is canceled. But this claim runs into major biblical problems. First, the apostles kept worshiping at the temple. After Yeshua's resurrection and ascension, the disciples were still in the temple praising God, written in Luke 24:53. In Acts, the apostles attended the temple daily, shown in Acts 2:46, 5:42. Peter and John went up at the hour of prayer, the time associated with daily offerings shown in Acts 3:1. And Paul participated in temple rites connected with sacrificial offerings written in Acts 21:26, 24:17. If sacrifice had become anti-gospel, the apostles' behavior becomes inexplicable. Whatever their understanding was, they did not treat temple worship as an enemy of Messiah's atonement. Next, we must understand the early prophets foreseeing of future sacrifices in the near future. Ezekiel chapters 40-48 describes a future temple with offerings. Isaiah and Zechariah also envision sacrifices in a future era in Isaiah 56, 6-8. Zechariah 14:21 and Jeremiah links the future Davidic hope with Levitical service shown in Jeremiah 33:15-18. Furthermore, the book of Revelation in chapter 7, verse 7 reveals that out of the 144,000 tribes of Israel, there will be a restoration of 12,000 Jews of the tribe of Levi, or the Levitical priesthood in the future. The question arises, why would there be a restoration of Levites if it didn't involve the restoration of sacrifice also? And if sacrifices were permanently abolished at the cross, why do the prophets portray them as returning in the future? Next, we must understand how the book of Hebrews defines the Messiah's priesthood in heaven. The book of Hebrews adds something crucial. Messiah's priestly ministry is presented as heavenly, not earthly. Hebrews 8:4 says that if Yeshua was on earth, he would not be a priest, because there are priests who offer gifts according to the law. That only makes sense if the author assumes the Torah's priestly order still governs the earthly sphere. So Hebrews does not read like, the Torah is gone. It reads like, Messiah's priesthood is in a higher realm in the true sanctuary. Here is the key that resolves the tension that many may miss. The Bible distinguishes the purpose of animal sacrifices from the purpose of Messiah's sacrifice. The book of Hebrews is blunt. It is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins, shown in Hebrews 10:4. And again, those sacrifices can never take away sins, shown in Hebrews 10:11. So what did they actually do? Hebrews answers, animal sacrifices sanctify for the purification of the flesh, but Messiah's sacrifice purifies the conscience, written in Hebrews 9:13-14. That is a difference in level and venue. In other words, it's twofold. Animal sacrifices functioned within the earthly sanctuary system. They dealt with ritual and physical impurity, cleansing sacred space and restoring the worshiper's ability to approach God's dwelling place on earth on a corporate level. They maintained holiness in the physical temple or tabernacle. Messiah's sacrifice or death, however, accomplishes what animals never could. True removal of sin in the deepest sense, reconciling us to God, purifying the conscience, and establishing a spiritual eternal access. The sacrifices were shadows of the Messiah, written in Colossians 2:17 and Hebrews 10:1. Shadows aren't lies, they are outlines. They don't replace reality, but they point to it. What does Hebrews mean in Hebrews 10:18 when it says, "Where there is forgiveness, there is no longer any offering for sin"? Many interpret this as no more animal sacrifices ever, but Hebrews has already told us animal sacrifices never remove sin in the ultimate sense. So the point is not that animal offerings once achieved final forgiveness and now they don't. The point is that Messiah does not need to be offered repeatedly. His sacrifice is complete once for all and never needs repeating. In other words, Hebrews is emphasizing the finality of Messiah's offering, not necessarily issuing a blanket statement that Torah's earthly ritual system is metaphysically invalid or no longer useful. It is contrasting repetition and finality, repeated shadows versus one definitive reality. Finally, Hebrews 8:13 acknowledges something important. Hebrews does say the earthly order is aging and will vanish. But vanish is attached to the transition from the present age to the world to come, not necessarily to the moment of the crucifixion. As long as human mortality and impurity remain features of reality, the earthly system, if a temple existed, would still have a coherent purpose within its own sphere. Furthermore, Ezekiel's future land allotment in chapter 48 clearly gives the distinction of two separate places within the vicinity of each other. A place for a city and a separate place for a temple, which is centered in the center of the plateau. When God sets up his kingdom on earth, the temple apart from the city will be the worship center for mortals who still are dealing with sin. The righteous immortals will live in God's dwelling place, the New Jerusalem, also called Ezekiel's city, after it descends to the earth. They will have no need of a temple or sacrifices because they have the direct access to God in the city. So, in this case, the sacrifices will eventually vanish since the New Jerusalem city is our ultimate destination. So, what does this mean for believers now? There is no temple standing today. So, the sacrificial system is not in operation, not because the apostles rejected it, but because the temple was destroyed and has not been restored. Without a temple, there is no lawful place for such offerings. So where does that leave believers? It leaves us with a clearer understanding. Sacrifice taught Israel the cost of holiness and the seriousness of sin on a physical level. Sacrifice maintained purity in God's earthly dwelling so people could draw near to God corporately. It was never salvational. Sacrifice pointed forward to Messiah, who alone provides eternal reconciliation. The Messiah's death did not cancel the sacrifices. If the temple stood today, the sacrificial and Levitical laws would still apply, but they would not be efficacious for salvation any more than they were before the Messiah came. Furthermore, when people came to bring their sacrifices to the temple, it brought people together corporately on a national level. Passover or Pesach is crucial here because it is explicitly a sacrificial meal. The lamb is offered and then eaten in a commanded, remembered way. It's not just a ritual slaughter, it's a meal that brought people together. And they ate it at the Father's house or temple, much like going to someone's home and dining with them personally. Can you think of a more intimate setting than being invited to God's house to eat with Him? This is exactly what the temple was for: corporate worship and fellowship. So when someone says sacrifice is barbaric, the Bible invites us to look deeper. The question isn't whether ancient sacrifice feels strange to modern tastes. The question is then what God was teaching through it. In fact, in Isaiah 1:11, God explicitly states that He never takes pleasure in the death or blood of animals. When an innocent animal died in the place of the worshiper, it foreshadowed the Messiah who was also innocent and died in the place of believers. His sacrifice reveals the gravity and cost of sin. That sin ultimately brings death and required the giving of His own life in place of the believer. Instead of demanding the sinner's immediate death, God provides a substitute. That provision reveals true compassion. He makes a way for restoration rather than immediate destruction. In some ways, sacrifice was used as shock treatment for acknowledging sin. However, the sacrifices were never about legalism, but on how God wanted to be approached in His holy way, and that sin breaks the relationship with Him. Thank you for watching the Israel Illuminated channel. If you like our channel, please like and subscribe, and we'll see you on the next one.